Shalom Zion, and welcome back to another episode of A Hidden Identity Awakened. In episode 4, we're going to be discussing the Moors. There are many things and inquiries a lot of our people don't even know about the Moors. And quite frankly so, the Moors are just another hidden truth that was kept from us, kept from our people by our enemies. Now, did you even know that the Moors were extremely instrumental in developing the European countries? And no, I'm not talking about as handmaids and servants. The Moors brought an intuitive of knowledge to the European countries, such as never seen before cultivating skills, technology, writings, languages, mathematics, and much, much more. The Moors' incredible skills of creativity and their extremely high IQ would set the European countries in motion like never before, propelling them from the Dark Era. Everything that the Moors brought with them would later spread to the West and beyond. But you want to know something? Our deceiving enemies would secretly have this information hid from us. You see, Zion? The world does not want you to know that the Moors brought new discoveries of all sorts, and the fact that they were black would take away from the heathens' glory. Even the word of the Most High confirmed that they would cause the name of Israel to cease. Look around us. Look how much they have hidden from us. That ought to tell you something. But don't worry, because the Most High has a plan. You cannot keep the sleeping lions sleep too long. And you better be careful, because once you bag a lion into a corner, all hell's gonna break loose. And that's what the world has done to the Most High's people. And these lions are rising up. Go ahead and grab your Bibles and turn to Psalms 83, because I'm going to show you what our enemies have been doing to us for thousands of years. And let's start with verse 2. It says, "For lo, thine enemies make a tumult, and they that hate thee have lifted up the head." Now, doesn't that sound familiar, what it said in Matthew and Mark, that we will be hated among all nations? Let's continue, verse 3. "They have taken crafty counsel against thy people, and consulted against thy hidden ones." Who have been hidden? We have. The Most High's people have been hidden ever since they fled from Jerusalem in 70 AD. We have been a hidden people. And now the Most High is revealing his people. He is awakening his people all over the world, and no one can stop it. I mean, no one. And no one can debunk the Spirit of the Most High. These dry bones are awakening. Let's go to verse 4. "They have said, Come, and let us cut them off from being a nation." Do you hear this, Zion? Do you understand what this verse is saying? Let's read that again. "They have said, Come, and let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be no more in remembrance." Now, this is profound, because this is prophecy being fulfilled right before our very eyes. And for thousands of years, our enemy have consulted to try to cut us off and to try to have our name not remembered anymore. But all their follies have failed. All the trillions of dollars they spent in media, religion, all manner of stuff, the music industry, all failed. They can no longer hide our identity. The gig is up. Let's look at verse 5. It says, "For they have consulted together with one consent. They are confederate against thee. Why do you think the heathens have their think tanks? They sit around at these circle tables and consult together amongst themselves to conspire against the children of Israel. How can we keep these people down? How can we keep them ignorant? Yeah, we got it. Let's tell them that they were just a bunch of monkeys with low IQs that just over the years gained some kind of knowledge. They'll believe it. They'll believe anything we tell them. But you see, Zion, what the heathens don't realize is that all the lies have been exposed, and more things are coming out that the Most High is revealing. Remember, everything that's done in the dark will come to the light. And the Moors was just one of those things they tried to hide. And I would encourage all you all to study more in depth about the Moors. So let's go ahead and begin this journey of the Moors by getting the meaning of the name Moor. Variants of the term Moor have been used by many Europeans since ancient times as a general description for the indigenous Africans. Contrary to popular belief, the term is not synonymous with Islamic or any specific Arab or African religion, civilization, or ethnicity. The origin of the English term Moor is the Greek word mavro, which literally means black. Blackened or charred, and has been long used to describe black or very dark things such as Mavri Thalassa, which refers to the Black Sea, or Mavri Spilya, which means black cave. The ancient Greeks used the term to describe the complexion of Africans, and even today, some Greeks use mavro to refer to Africans. Now think about it, Zion. The word Moor is not a people at all. It's a color, plain and simple. Now, if we were living during those days throughout Europe, we simply would be classified as Moors or Moorish. Now, we know that not all blacks are Israelites, but however, there are those classified as Moor who were Hebrew descent. Many of our people get the Moors mixed up with black Muslims. The word Moor is not associated with any religion at all. Moor is just means color, just means black. That's it. But however, you had Moors who were Islamic converts. You even had Christian Moors. Some of the Moors were embedded in many different religions and practices. Now, if you go to Wikipedia, which in my honest opinion, I think Wikipedia is a big misrepresentation of the Moors. However, the Wikipedia does not always give you the truth on things. So if you really want to understand the Moors, you got to go to the Latin writings, not the English. But in the Wikipedia, it refers to the Moors as primarily to the Muslim inhabitants of the Maghreb people. And they don't really go into details of what the Moors are. So again, you really got to dig deep into the Latin writings if you want to understand more about the Moors. Now, one not need to be a linguist to see the word's evolution from the Greek mavro to the Latin word mars, actually marvo in the ablative, singular, masculine Latin form. The English transliteration is Marius or Morris, and the plural form is Mari, specifically used by ancient Romans in reference to black Africans. Now, ain't that something? Writers in both Greek and Latin specifically use the term as a racial identity. In the Epitome de Cerebus, around 390 AD, we learned that Emilianus was a Moor by race. Procopius of Caesarea, around 500 to 565 AD, a Byzantine scholar who wrote in Greek, said in the history of the wars, beyond that there are men not black-skinned like the Moors.
The term Moor started to become interchangeable with the term black because it was basically the same thing. But when the slave trade started, they tried to objectify black people, Moorish people. So they would use the term interchangeably and they would just switch on to calling people black. But if you look at a lot of old documents, there's even slave ships called Blackamoor. If you look at slave records, there was even a boxer out of Virginia who was very popular in the early 1800s named Tom Molyneux, and his nickname was the Moor. So that name was definitely used interchangeably with black or Negro at that time.
Moor means black, like Negro, Ethiopian. Moor means black. Moor is not a people. Moor is a color. And they have taken this word Moor and they have associated Moor with Muslim. There were Moors that weren't Muslim. Moor means black. There were Christian Moors. There were Moors that practiced a traditional African faith system. So that Moor means black, simple.
When the Moors went into Europe, they changed the appearance of the population. Do you see? So you have Italians, Spaniards being darker than the Scandinavians. A Scandinavian person told me that they never considered the Italians or Jewish people to be white. Do you see? Because the lighter people are further north.
When I went to Europe, I would always look at pictures and I would always see a Moor, and sometimes I would see like a skull and bones. And many of the Moors would have a skull and bones flag. That's what pirates are known for. There were many Moorish pirates. There was even a Barbary War where the U.S. was fighting Moorish pirates up in North Africa and the Barbary Coast. And there's even a secret organization called the Skull and Bones. And we know that Masonry comes from Moorish science. So there's always a connection there with the Moors.
And it's important that as we begin to develop an understanding of this society, that it's not Freemason as we know it. And that the Moors brought in this knowledge into Europe. Africans brought this knowledge into Europe. And in bringing this knowledge into Europe, the Knights Templars and other organizations were born out of this. And peoples of European descent were exposed to alchemy, okay? The periodic table of elements, the laboratory, how to take information, how to take elements and atoms, and to begin to manipulate them to make them into different types of molecules. The basic one is hydrogen, 2 hydrogen is helium, 3 hydrogen is lithium, 6 is carbon, 8 is oxygen. So you have this alchemy that's going to come, and they're going to begin to study, they're going to begin to learn, they're going to create societies that's going to develop an understanding. This is going to be what eventually is going to become Freemasonry, because only a select group of people in Europe is going to be exposed to this information.
Because the secret of Masonry, of who we really are, the Moors, is being here on this land, this particular land. Because it was called, in many names, you had Turtle Island, that we called it, or Tula, or El Morocco, the different terms that we had. And the original map of America was written by a guy named Idrisi. The original map was written in Sanskrit.
Antarctica was actually mapped by a Moor. And most people don't know it was mapped by a Moor. And they have old topographical evidence of old maps of Antarctica. That's why the Nazis fled there, because they knew that there were places there under the ice that they could actually inhabit and hide.
Now, the brother at the beginning mentioned that there were slave ships that were named after the Moors. And now, if you do a study and you look up all the different names of the slave ships, you're going to find out that there's tons of them. I mean, tons of them. And I remember reading about this stuff when I was growing up, about the different names of the slave ships. And there were so many. And you can't tell me that these other nations were benefiting off our people. I mean, they were making good off of our people. Why do you think the colonizers were racing to America? Get it? Racing to America? It wasn't about no religion. It was about get all you can get with all the black free labor you can get. That's what it was all about. That's what the rise of America was all about. But nobody wants to talk about that. Instead, they lie to us and they tell us that the reason why the colonizers came over to America was because of religious persecution. But nothing could be further from the truth. These colonizers had slaves. The presidents had slaves. You can't tell me that these folks were just coming over here just to be coming over here to America for a better life. Yeah, it was for a better life, along with all the free black labor they can get. That's what it was all about. And see, that's why you're not going to see this in the history books, because the world hates the truth. Now, there was someone else mentioned in this clip by the name of Tom Melano. Now, he was a boxer in the early 1800s, and it was mentioned that his nickname was the Moor. So I took the liberty to look him up because I wanted to see for myself if his nickname was really the Moor. So Tom Melano, he was born around 1784 and he died in 1818. And he was a very well-known boxer, a bare-knuckle boxer during that time. So as I was looking him up, lo and behold, I came across an article that said Tom the Moor Melano. I was like, wow, okay. So it made me a believer. And there were other references that I looked up that showed that his nickname was the Moor. But you know, this is the kind of stuff that you don't hear about. This is the kind of stuff that no one tells you. And all these years, nobody will ever tell you this kind of stuff. Nobody will ever tell you this kind of stuff in your schools, your universities, your churches, definitely not. But you know, it's just amazing how much information can be hidden from us. And now all this stuff is starting to come out. More and more stuff. There's still a lot of things that the Most High is constantly revealing to his people that was hidden from us. And I'm telling you, as we get closer and closer to the end, the Most High is going to bring more and more to the light. So what I want to show you now is a clip by a man named Dr. Ivan Van Sertima. He's a well-known lecturer for his time, and he gives some very important points regarding the Moors. Now I want you to pay close attention to what he has to say. Now this clip is very long, so I don't have the whole clip. I'll leave the link at the bottom of the comment section, but I took bits and pieces because I really want you to see the importance that he brings out in reference to the Moors. You're going to see in this clip that many of the Moors were Islamic converts, and that was because of the heavy widespread of Islamics, especially throughout Europe and Africa. But that still don't take away from a lot of the Moors' Hebraic descent. So pay close attention and watch the points that were brought out, and then we're going to come back and discuss some things.
And so let me read a little bit about Ivan in a method of introducing him. He was born in Guyana, South America. He was educated at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London University and the Rutgers Graduate School, and holds degrees in African Studies, Linguistics, and Anthropology. He's a literary critic, a linguist, and an anthropologist, and has made a name for himself in all three fields. As a literary critic, he's the author of Caribbean Writers, a collection of critical essays in the Caribbean novel. He's also the author of several major literary reviews published in Denmark, in India, in Britain, and the United States. He was honored for his work in this field by being asked by the Nobel Committee of the Swedish Academy to nominate candidates for the Nobel Prize in Literature from 1976 to 1980. And as a linguist, he has published essays on the dialect of the Sea Islands of the Georgia coast. He is also the compiler of the Swahili Dictionary of Legal Terms. Now, many of you probably say, I didn't know anything like that existed. Based on his fieldwork in Tanzania, in East Africa in 1967. He's the author, as you probably know, of They Came Before Columbus, The African Presence in Ancient America, the most comprehensive and thorough book of its type currently available. It was published by Random House in 1977 and is currently in its 10th printing. It was published in French in 1981, and in the same year was awarded the Clarence L. Hope Prize, a prize awarded every 2 years for work of excellence in literature and the humanities relating to the cultural heritage in the African diaspora. Professor Van Sertima is the associate professor, or is an associate professor, of African Studies at Rutgers University in New Jersey, and editor of the Journal of African Civilizations. I could say a lot more, but I'm just going to introduce him, and instead of introducing him as Ivan Van Sertima, I'm going to introduce him as Ivan the Great, because that's what I think he is.
I want to begin my lecture tonight by expressing my great gratitude to Runoko Rashidi Lee Grant Clegg II, James Bronson, Don Luke, and all the others who have made major contributions to the journal. One of the things that became very obvious to me when I completed They Came Before Columbus was the fact that one was very much alone. This is how I felt for many years. I knew very little about the work that was happening around me. I knew about Chancellor Williams, yes, I knew about Diop. I knew also about Rogers, but there were very few people that I felt were involved in what I was involved in. Many of the articles I had read, many things I had seen around me were not involved in any serious, in-depth study of African contributions. It was merely enough to make a mention, something that was tantalizing, something that was provocative, but very seldom proven with a heavy body of authorities. What I am extremely pleased about is that there has arisen since 1977, the publication of my book, a whole school of scholars. Men like Rashidi, who is the first person who has edited one of the journals, the last issue, African Presence in Early Asia. And I'm extremely grateful for that, because Asia is one area in which I have done very little research, and without Rashidi's assistance, that journal would have been impossible. It is very important to know this, that we are involved not in any individual thrust, we are involved in a collective crusade. This is a crusade that involves us all. There is a spirit alive in the world. One sees it as one goes out of this country. I saw it in England. I remember many years ago, about 8 years ago, when I visited England and I saw my younger brother, and I took to him a copy of They Came Before Columbus. I had just completed it, and I gave it to him as a Christmas present, and he was very annoyed. He took it and threw it across the room. This was a man I had not seen for 10 years. And he said, "You spent 10 years studying Africans? I know they hunt lions, they're rather brave, but what else?" That is the colonization of the imagination to which we were subject. Suddenly I was brought back over 10 years. I had not realized the vast distance I had traveled in my head. I had come back to another planet of the mind. To hear my brother speak, I knew, because I was educated like him, I was trained like him. In fact, I had gone further in the betrayal of the black race than anyone I know, because I was as anti-myself as anything could be. I mean, when it comes to the colonization of the imagination, I was the perfect model. I was the perfect blueprint of the British. There was a phase of rebellion which was extreme. In fact, I was one of the people who was mentioned in a white paper in the British Parliament as being viciously anti-white, anti-British. Years afterwards, I wondered if it was the same person. I had become so tamed by the misfortune of that period that I had promised never to open my mouth again against the empire. It is quite clear that I did not keep that promise. However, when I went back to England in January of this year and Sheikh Anta Diop appeared on the same platform with me, that was a new England. There was my brother sitting in the audience listening to me for the very first time with tears in his eyes. He could not recognize the man who was his own family. And there underwent a conversion. And this is the sort of thing that I'm talking about, conversion. That we are involved in a crusade that is as serious as the crusade of Christ or the crusade of Muhammad. A crusade that alters consciousness. A crusade that is almost religious in terms of its intensity and in terms of its impact and effect. One can actually change the mind of the world. Only history can do that. We cannot do that by being overwhelmed constantly by the living present, because the present is only a fragment of reality. It is truly said that reality, appearance is seldom reality, and reality seldom appears. And the reason why reality seldom appears is that you have to make reality. Reality is the evocation of a wholeness. A wholeness must contain the past aspects of the living present and have shadows stretching out towards the future. This is what we are trying to do. And you can only do it by reconnecting the past to the living present. The prejudices which we suffer today, the colonization of the imagination, the kind of blindness that exists in Western civilization is due to profound errors and often profound misrepresentations, deliberate conspiracies against the history of the African and the history of other peoples in the third world. What we are learning at this conference is tremendously important because we become aware through the work of these various scholars involved in this what lay at the very root of European civilization. I'll never forget Gandhi's statement when he was asked, "What do you think of European civilization?" And Gandhi said, "It would have been a good idea." Because truly, there was no proper civilization in Europe. The Greeks had nothing that we could boast about until they met the Africans in Egypt. And this is not speculation. The Greeks say so themselves. In the new book that comes out in December, African Presence in Early Europe, which is the most comprehensive volume in the world on this subject. It is larger even than Blacks in Science. It's the most ambitious project attempted by the Journal of African Civilizations. We have an essay by Martin Bernal, who is a classicist scholar. He, in fact, was related in some way to some of the early works of Gerald Massey, etc., through the family. And Martin Bernal shows that initially there was an ancient model which the Greeks built up, showing quite clearly, not only through Herodotus but through Euripides and Aeschylus, that they were very well aware that most of their gods, that many of their sciences, their philosophic concepts depended upon the African. They make this quite clear in statement after statement, and they have no doubt as to who the early Egyptians were. They actually saw them. They weren't speculating about them. And they said they had woolly hair and black skin. I'll never forget Sheikh Anta Diop bringing that up at the Cairo conference in 1974, and a modern Egyptian who has nothing to do with the pyramids jumping up, Abdullah was his name, jumping up and saying, even if they're black skinned, they're white. I saw echoes of that just a month ago. I was on the radio in New Orleans, and a white professor called up and says, "I cannot understand how you could say such a thing about the early Egyptians being black. Everyone knows that they were Caucasoid Hamites." And I said, "But why then did the Greeks say they had black skin and woolly hair?" He said, "Yes, because they're Hamites. They were burnt by the sun." I said, "My dear good fellow, this is not a minstrel show. You cannot put on black skin and woolly hair when you want to claim a civilization, and then when you don't want to claim it, when you want to push us out, you say it's pure lily white. How come you put on your black skin in order to become lily white whenever you try to interfere with our civilization?" He was not aware, and this is a professor who should know something about Egypt. He spoke so eloquently about Egypt. He was not aware about Tarseti. Few of you are aware of how important some of the articles in the journal are, how original many of them are, how original in their view, how original in their whole thrust. There are gentlemen who come to our lectures sometimes. For example, I was speaking on Saturday to a completely white audience, our professors and others, belonging to the Early Sites Research Society. And I was talking to them about Egypt because they know a lot about Egypt, but they think the Egyptians are white. And they were quite shocked to hear about Tarseti. They were quite shocked to hear of Diop. They'd never heard the name Diop before. They knew nothing about the melanin dosage test. They knew nothing about the test done in the mummies in the Marietta excavations. They knew nothing that the Celts had black blood. They all thought that making their noise about the Celts, they were talking about white people. They didn't know that when the Romans invaded Britain, they saw lots of black people around them. They knew nothing about the origin of any of these things. They knew nothing about a black king in Ireland or a black Viking. The black has been completely wiped out of history. And whenever he becomes difficult to wipe out, you have to give him a title. Like, for example, when they found a black mummy, just a few years ago, they found a black mummy preceding any of the other Egyptian mummies, and they said he was a dancer. He couldn't be a king since he was black, therefore he had to be a dancer. Why did they choose a dancer? Most of you can immediately jump to conclusions why he had to be a dancer. And there's a marvelous picture in the Times in London. Here is the black dancing, and here are these whites in Bauderic hairstyles surrounding the black, and they are sitting on the thrones. And the question arises, why weren't they mummified? Why is only the dancer mummified? Were they trying to freeze his rhythm? These absurdities do not appear as absurdities because you have a blindness in the eye of the world. And the same thing that happened to the Americans and the Egyptians happened to the Moors. When you talk about the Moors today, you're not talking about the Moors that went into Europe. You're talking about a mishmash of people with a whole complex of blood in the place they call Mauritania. Do not confuse the modern Moor with the ancient Moor. Some of them still are black. Do not confuse the modern Egyptian with the ancient Egyptian, though some of them are still black. Do not confuse the modern American with the ancient American, so some of them are still true Americans. This is why the historical thing becomes so problematic, because we have to constantly realize what we are talking about. The word is first used, it seems, by the Greeks. Moros means dark or black. And when the Romans invade West Africa in 46 BC, they speak of the West Africans as Mores, black people, from the Greek moros, dark, black. There are other origins of the word, mero leading to moro, etc., so that you have sometimes the Ethiopian thing, the word for Ethiopians, which is Ethiops, Greek also, burnt skin, the word for Moor, and at some time Ethiop and Moor being interchangeable for all black Africans. When Shakespeare speaks of the Moor, he thinks of him as a black African. Whether it is Othello or whether it is the figure in Titus Andronicus, he has accepted that the word Moor is the term for black African. You find in many cases in Europe where that word appears linked to a European name, you can go right back and find black ancestry down that European line. So the word is used initially to deal with black people. However, it becomes more confused as we go on. But the original Moors, the ancestor of the Moors, are the Garamantes. There we see them in the Sahara at first, and we see evidence of their civilization. We see their horse-drawn chariots, we see rock engravings of them since 5000 BC, we see javelin-armed men, etc. But as history progresses, they become far more complex people. They're not just involved in farming, etc. They also become involved in far more complex tasks until they become an almost invincible people, and they're mentioned by the Romans, etc. There are also another set of people who became mixed up with the Moors. The Libyans in the north of Egypt. Now, this is a very confusing thing too, because some people speak of those early Libyans as Negroid, and there may have been some black Libyans, but we also have white Libyans in the north of Egypt. They are called Tamahu by the Egyptians. Tama means people, hue means white or light ivory, of light ivory skin. And we find them defeated by the blacks in the first dynasty. Menes makes a raid against these fair-skinned people, and they are defeated and crushed by the blacks, and then they are kept in control. We also have later evidence of thrusts against them by the blacks on the Sethos in the 18th dynasty, also raids by the Sudanese, etc. But these Libyans, some of the fair-skinned types, go back into parts of northern Africa, intermixed with blacks, and we have a mix of these people, so that we both have black Moors, which are the Garamante type, and we also have tawny or white Moors, which include the mixed type and the fair-skinned type. Jesus, as you know, was not very much liked by the Jews. Muhammad was not very much liked by the Arabs. You may well ask, how could they become kings of the Jews and the Arabs and they're not particularly liked by them? That is the nature of things. Because Jesus, we must bear in mind, Jesus started to preach things which antagonized the Jewish high priest. Jesus was mad enough to take up a whip and run into the temple and chase the Jews out of it. They never forgave him for that. And Jesus had the cheek, the effrontery to tell them, Moses said an eye for an eye and a tooth for tooth, but I say, as though he could put himself over and above Moses. The same thing was true of Muhammad. Muhammad made statements that eventually led him to be run out of his country. Most of you know of the flight. In fact, the beginning of the year for the Muslims begin with this flight. The flight is in 622. It's known as the Hijrah. And this is one of the significant things in the life of Muhammad and in the beginnings of Mohammedanism. As you know, when Jesus was born, he had to be smuggled into Africa. Jesus was born in Bethlehem, but he was smuggled into Africa. He lived in the village of Marathia on the edge of Heliopolis, and there he remained, we know, for at least 12 years, because the first time we hear of Jesus after his birth is when he's sitting with the Egyptian doctors talking. And then we do not know what happens to him for a long time, though there are theories about this. Some Jews say that he was an Essene, which means he was trained by the Egyptians, and then he comes back, as the Bible says in Hosea, out of Egypt shall I call my son. He comes back out of Africa, and he goes to begin his mission, which lasts for about 3 years before he is killed. I cannot, even though I'm dealing with the Muslim thing, I cannot leave Jesus alone at this point, because there are certain things that have to be understood. And one of these is, how come Christ became white? The only time Christ met white people was the day he was arrested, when the Roman soldiers came upon him. And the next time he had dealings with white people is when they were pushing the sword up in his side. Yet here he is, blue-eyed and blonde-haired, and his only encounter with Europeans are with policemen and soldiers. And it's very important to note that there is no harm, nevertheless, in representing God or what you conceive to be God in your own image. There's no crime in that. The Europeans had a perfect right to make Christ white, because once they were converted to Christ, fine. But don't go pushing it down other people's throats. That is the point. Don't come telling me about the white Christ, because the first physical representation of Christ is found on a coin of Justinian II. And when you look at him, he has African hair, he has the woolly hair, he has brown skin, he has a Semitic type nose, which you could find, for example, on the so-called, the thing they have in the Vatican, which they wouldn't allow to be carbon dated, but the Shroud of Turin. But it is quite clear that we are dealing with a type that is mixed, and which, as Edward Kennedy, to my surprise, pointed out to that bigot a few months ago, that if Jesus was in South Africa, he would be called a black, and he would be treated like a black. Muhammad transcends also the littleness of the people around him, so that these men represent, they're not to be seen in racial terms, they represent the very best in human consciousness, in human vision, the vision of the human, and they transcend race and sex. That is the reason why they became universal principles in the world. We are not to attack Christianity or to attack Islam because of excesses by Arabs or Jews, because that has nothing to do with the essential Christ or the essential doctrine of Muhammad. We have to go back to when it was a revolutionary doctrine, when it had the pristine quality that could transform the world, because men take anything and make it into anything. You have men on the slave ships writing beautiful hymns, Jesus, you lover of my soul, and they have blacks dying right under them while they're writing their beautiful hymns to Jesus. That has nothing to do with Jesus. As Marx once said, I am not a Marxist. And Jesus would have said, if he saw what the Europeans were doing with Christianity, I'm not a Christian. Well, we have to distinguish the church from the religion, because the church does not necessarily follow the tenet, the revolutionary tenet, the revolutionary spirit involved in religion, because Jesus was a rebel. He was fighting European imperialism of the Romans as we are fighting imperialism today. He was crucified, however, not because of that opposition, because they did not take him seriously. He had not yet begun to affect, not until his death, he had not yet begun to affect that Roman. What the people who made sure that he was crucified are his own people. One only hopes that that is not a prophecy of what will happen to some of our leaders, because very often it is that the vision and consciousness of people can become so limited that in their stupidity and blindness they destroy that which can save them. After his death, trouble broke out because his father-in-law, Abu Bakr, was elected as the leader, whereas Ali, his brother-in-law, nearest in blood, some people felt should have been the successor to Muhammad. Hence, from the very beginning, Mohammedanism split into two factions: the Shiites, who believed in hereditary rights and thought that the brother-in-law nearest in blood to Muhammad should succeed, and the Sunnites, or Sunni Muslims, who believed that it was right that Abu Bakr should be elected as being the most fit in the family to be successor to Muhammad. This struggle between the Sunnis and the Shiites, or the Sunnites and the Shiites, is going to become very important in our consideration of the Moors. However, after Muhammad's death, you have a thrust by the Muslims into various parts of the world. They moved into Egypt as early as 638 AD. They conquer Egypt. They move into Tripoli in 643 AD. They cover southwest Morocco 681 AD. And then as they move down into Africa, they make thrust into India. They make thrust even as far as China. They make thrust down into Africa. And in Africa, many people are converted to Islam. It appeals to them just as Christian doctrine was to appeal to a lot of people, eventually overcoming the very people who attempted to destroy the Christ. This Islam spreads rapidly in Africa. In some places it is resisted, in some places it is accepted. And eventually some Africans are made, as under the Muslims, some Africans become major figures promoting Islam. Musa bin Nasir becomes governor of North Africa in 698 AD. And he is a very ambitious man who intends to conquer as much territory as possible, and who has his eyes looking across the Straits of Gibraltar towards the southern part of Europe. But he cannot advance on Europe because he has to complete his conquest of North Africa. And in North Africa there is a tremendous fortress which is almost invincible. It's known as Ceuta, and it is controlled by Count Julian. It is almost invincible. Nothing can defeat Julian. But Julian sends his virgin daughter over to Spain to spend some time with Roderick in the court of Roderick. Roderick is the king of Spain, and he's the head of the Visigoths, who have been in control for about 2 centuries. And while his virgin daughter is in the court of Roderick, she ceases to be a virgin as a result of Roderick's adventures. And Julian gets very angry, switches his allegiance, and offers help to the Africans and Arabs to march over the straits. Now the Africans first send out Tarif in 710 AD. Tarif is important because he enters our language. Whenever you hear about tariffs, that comes from him. Taxes on goods coming in or goods going out. A tariff, that comes from the word tarif, an African. This is followed he is successful in his first raid, and this is followed in 711, the very next year, by Tariq. Tariq takes with him 7,000 troops, most of them African. When I say most of them are African, you have to understand, as I was explaining, that although the ancestors of the Moors are the Garamantes, and which is a black type, you also have other types of Moors, like the Libyan mixture, or the so-called Berber. And you have Berbers who are blue-eyed and blonde-haired in Africa, just as you have black Berbers, because you have trickling of people, nomadic types, coming out of southern Europe, crossing into Africa. Africa is very close to Europe. It's only 20 miles distance north than Africa. So you do have some types which are not black, but the majority of them, as described, are black, dark skin. You have Toynbee, who is a very conservative historian. This is what he says of the first dynasty. Now, there are 4 major dynasties in Europe that are Muslim. The first one is called the Umayyad dynasty. And Toynbee, speaking of them, says the Arabs, who were the ruling element of the Umayyad Caliphate, called themselves the swarthy people. Swarthy means dark skin, with a connotation of racial superiority, and their Persian and Turkish subjects were known by them as the ruddy people, with a connotation of racial inferiority. That is to say, they drew the distinction that we draw between blondes and brunettes, but they reversed the value, so that the darker you were, the more superior you were thought to be. Hence, there couldn't be white people moving into Europe, okay, because you would not have the reversal of value. Now, it is amazing how these people are described, because I have read a book, for example, by Charlotte Young, I think it was, and all through the book, right up to page 175, the Moors are fair-skinned with blue eyes. And as soon as they start to be defeated, blacks are falling on the battlefield. Where they come from, I don't know. As I said, it is a mystery that they are so absent in life and have such a great presence in death. The movement, the first dynasty is known as the Umayyad dynasty. It is a Sunni dynasty, and they rule Spain from 715 to 750. By the way, I have to point out to you that this thrust did not only overcome Spain, it also took parts of Portugal. And during the years 715 to 750 AD, you have movements which continue, which take over parts of France, like Lyons, Macon, Chalon-sur-Saône. All of these places are taken over by the Moors. So you have a big chunk of Europe, what is known as the Iberian Peninsula, that are taken over by black troops, and Arab types which are both black, as well as a few of them being fair-skinned types. The situation, however, does not remain very firm much after 750, because the Shiites and the Sunnites are fighting. These are Muslim factions, and the Shiites murder the Caliph or king of the Umayyad dynasty. In 750, he's assassinated. He goes on a visit to Mesopotamia and he's assassinated, and almost the whole royal family is killed. The royal family are holidaying in Damascus, and 70 members of the royal family are assassinated by the Shiites. And then come the Shiite dynasty, which is known as the Abbasid dynasty, which only runs for about 5 to 6 years. It's ruled by Abu al-Abbas. But in Africa, and this is very important to note, that the very opposite to what happened recently in relation to Europe and Africa began to happen in relation to Africa to Europe. The Africans maintain their power in Africa and keep a colony in Europe, so that when weakness occurs in Europe, they go back into Africa, strengthen themselves, and thrust again into Europe. And you find this happening when a Sunni by the name of Abdul Rahman goes back into Africa, strengthens himself, collects an African army, and charges back into Europe, smashes the Abbasid dynasty, and resurrects the Umayyad dynasty. So after a period of about 5 or 6 years, the Umayyad dynasty takes control again in Europe. Now I want to run down to you these dynasties before I tell you about the achievements of the Moors in Europe, because the achievements of the Moors in Europe are something astonishing. You would be absolutely amazed now that we have a body of scholars, because I'm drawing now upon the work of Wayne Chandler, Sheikh Anthony Diop, Chancellor Williams, John Jackson, and research that I have done myself. You would be absolutely astonished by the enormity of the contribution of the Moors. This is going to have, you will see, a profound effect on the Industrial Revolution and what is known as the European Renaissance in the arts and sciences. But it's important to understand what were the dynasties and how do we know some of them were black, because in some cases the racial situation is very confused, in other cases it is very, very clear. And a lot of problems have arisen in the study of the Moors because of the fact that we have so few pictures. In previous situations where we are studying African history, our problem has been that the European has destroyed so much. We have the destruction of the Library of Alexandria, we have the destruction of Library of Timbuktu, we have the destruction of books in America, only half a dozen of which survive. We have the systematic destruction of Moorish libraries at Granada in 1492, the year Columbus sailed. But here we have something which is equally annoying. The Muslims do not believe in making portraits of themselves. They consider that a kind of idolism. And therefore, we have very few pictures of the Moors. In fact, most of the pictures we have of the Moors are drawn by their enemies. And we do have a few slides here today which I will show you, including the cover for the book, African Presence in Early Europe. But as I say, there are very few. Then comes another African. This is the last and the most African of all the dynasties. This is known as the Almohade. A man arises, a leader in Africa in the early 12th century who calls himself Mahdi, or the Mahdi, and his followers begin to strengthen themselves, and they push aside the Almoravids and they invade Europe, and by 1150 their armies defeat the Christians of Spain. This is the last of the great African dynasties. It runs right through to 1230 AD, when eventually the Christians begin to push the Africans back. About 3 million Africans go back down into Africa, and the things begin to break up in the Iberian Peninsula, and it still holds a certain strength for about 200 years until 1492, the very year Columbus sailed. The last great battle between the Christians and the Moors occurred, and the Christians are finally defeated at Granada, and a massive destruction of Moorish documents occurred. But what did the Moors bring to Europe? Why is it that Spain and Portugal, where the Moors were strongest, why is it that they led the expansion of Europe? Why is it that the thrust into America, into Africa, was led by Spain and Portugal? What special advantages did they have over the rest of Europe, and to what extent did the Moors have something to do with this? And here we come to their contributions. When the Moors entered Spain under Tariq in 711 AD, Europe was in the dark age. Whatever the Greeks may have done, whatever the Romans may have done, Europe had fallen into grave decline. European science was a joke compared to African and Asian science. The Europeans, for example, one of them was trying to show that the distance from the Earth to the Moon was the diameter of the Earth. In order to write the diameter of the Earth, he calculated or estimated the circumference and divided it by 2. That was the level of science. There was no complex mathematics, no complex science in either in Spain or any part of Europe at that time. Many advances that had been made by the Greeks and Romans were lost. So that when Chandler calls his article Light of Europe's Dark Age, this is a very true and precise statement of what was happening. Then comes the Moors. And the Moors caused a massive movement of knowledge into the places where they settle. Thus we find that Spain becomes the main center for the translation of all the works of antiquity. Egyptian works and all other works that are translated into Arabic, then they're translated into Spanish, then they're translated into Latin. Thus Europe becomes open, and the Muslims become open to the knowledge of the world. They thrust into India, they bring back various things. How many of us know that the Europeans only counted with letters? The Europeans did not have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. If you talk about Roman numerals, it's IX and X, and those are letters. The Greeks used letters to count with. The Romans used letters. It is the Indian, the Hindu, who had those numerals, and Arabs brought it out of India. Many things were brought out of Egypt. Many things were brought out of various parts of the world in order to build what was later to be known as Western civilization. So that we have an extraordinary situation. One of the things that is most remarkable is that the very things that were used to defeat us came from outside of Europe. Artillery, firearms are not European in origin. People like to say, oh, we defeated you because we had superior firepower. Where did they get it from? The Arabs. A manuscript in Leningrad, an Arabic manuscript, shows the first use of artillery by the Moors in a battle with the Indians. The chemical components of gunpowder are developed through the chemistry of the Moors. The Europeans do not know about gunpowder. Gunpowder had been used even earlier by the Egyptians, but it was not used in the way it was used by the Europeans later on. But the Arabs used it in that way. They did use it in artillery. And the first firing of artillery in the world is by the Moors. And the first use of gunpowder in that context. And the ships were so absolutely critical to the expansion of the European empire. Look at those ships. Take the caravel, for example, the Portuguese caravel. The Spanish caravel comes from the Arabic carabos, which comes from the pangalos, which is used on the Indian Ocean by both Arabs and Africans. The rudders, the special rudder, the four-cornered axial rudder, is found in China 206 BC, but long before it is found in China and brought by the Arabs, by the Moors into Europe, we find the prototype of that rudder lies with the Egyptians. The forerunner of the axial rudder is found among one of the Egyptian types of oars which operate in that way. We also find that many of the nautical instruments, the compass, the astrolabe, are not invented in Europe. They are brought in by the Moors from other parts of the world, so that Spain, where the Moors concentrated, became a center through which all of these things coalesced. That is the reason why Spain was able to make the first major thrust, and Portugal not because of any other special advantage, because when we compare what was happening in the rest of Europe, we are appalled. Let me, for example, read to you a passage of what was happening in one of the great centers of the Moors in Europe. In Cordova, the old packed Cordova, they found a city of 250,000 houses and 1 million people, when no city in Europe outside Moorish Spain had a population of 30,000. Its massive walls had a circuit of 14 miles and had 7 large iron gates faced with brass. Its streets were paved so soundly indeed that in some of them you tread the same stones today. Just as you cross the Guadalquivir on the same noble bridge, drained by large sewers, flushed with water from the many fountains which sparkled in the sun, and lit by lamps at night. It had 80,455 shops, besides 4,300 markets, and in these you could buy amber from the Baltic, Russian furs, Chinese tea, Indian spices, African ebony and ivory, and such native products in leather, metal, silk, glass, and pottery as could not be found elsewhere. It had 900 public baths. We are told that a poor Arab would go without bread rather than soap. and more than 1,000 mosques, the largest of which is still one of the architectural wonders of the world in spite of latest Spanish disfigurement. Its low scarlet and gold roof, supported by 1,000 columns of marble, jasper, and porphyry, was lit by thousands of brass and silver lamps which burned perfumed oil, the largest being 38 feet in circumference, containing 46,000 silver plates for reflecting the light. The exquisite prayer chamber, the unique pulpit, and the caliph's private section with floors of silver and gold-plated doors completed this wonderful monument of opulence and art. Some 5 miles along the broad road which led to it from the city, they would enter the most wonderful garden or park in the world. Engineers who had a skill that was unequaled until the 20th century so directed its water supply, note this, so directed its water supply that there were lakes, cascades, and superb fountains on every side, while every flower and shrub that would grow in Andalusia had been brought from the ends of the earth. This is what made possible the so-called European Renaissance. When we look at the arts and sciences, and that is something that is most remarkable, paper was introduced by the Moors into Spain. The windmill was introduced into Europe by the Moors. Gunpowder was introduced into Europe by the Moors. Artillery was introduced into Europe by the Moors. The nautical instruments like the astrolabe and the compass, the axe, the three-cornered or four-cornered axial rudder, the three-masted ships, all these were introduced by the Moors. Here we have claiming about all of this tremendous industrial revolution that came purely out of European genius. John Papademos, the Greek physicist at the Atlanta conference last year, pointed out to us that Newton, Isaac Newton, the greatest of European scientists, pointed to several things he got from the Africans. The heliocentric theory of the universe, the idea that the earth revolves and other planets revolve around the sun. When Newton said that, they thought he was a heretic. The Africans knew that long ago. He said that first atomic theory, and I'm talking about atomic fission now, the first atomic theory developed among the Africans. Newton said that. Several things he pointed to, and I discovered to my astonishment, a friend from somewhere, I don't know which part of America, sent me an article recently showing me that Newton was an Egyptologist. And that what Papademos was saying, that Newton had got through to this knowledge through Copernicus and Galileo and so forth. Now we find that Newton didn't need secondhand. He actually was studying the Egyptian manuscripts. While in the 10th and 11th centuries, all Europe could show scarcely a single public library, note this, and could boast of only 2 universities that were worthy of the name. There were in Spain at that same time, under the Moors, more than 70 public libraries, of which the one in Cordova alone contained 600,000 manuscripts. In addition, the country possessed 17 famous universities, among which those at Cordova, Seville, Granada, Malaga, Jaén, Valencia, Almería, and Toledo were especially outstanding. Astronomy, physics, chemistry, mathematics, geometry, philology, geography reached in Spain the highest stage at the time known anywhere. Artists and scholars united in special associations for the pursuit of their studies. There were regular congresses of all branches of science where the latest achievements of research were announced and discussed, which naturally contributed greatly to the spread of scientific thought. Another most amazing thing was that the Moors were the first to introduce air conditioning. They heated the houses in the winter, and they did an unusual thing which we do not even do now. When they brought cool air into the house, it wasn't just cool, it was perfumed. They ran it over banks of flowers, noted for their perfume. Art, literature, and science prospered as they then prospered nowhere else in Europe. Students flocked from France and Germany and England to drink from the fountain of learning which flowed only in the cities of the Moors. The surgeons and doctors were in the van of science. Women were encouraged to devote themselves to serious study, and the lady doctor was not unknown among the people of Cordova. Mathematics, astronomy, and botany, history, philosophy, and jurisprudence were to be mastered in Spain and Spain alone. The practical work of the field, the scientific methods of irrigation, the arts of fortification and shipbuilding, the highest and most elaborate products of the loom, the graver, and the hammer, The potter's wheel and the mason's trowel were brought to perfection by the Spanish Moors. And when we come to the end, and this is something that I really have to read, when we come to the very end, because it's said in words that one cannot equal in speech, the death that occurs in Spain, the death of greatness after the Moors are banished. In 1492, the last bulwark of the Moors gave way before the crusade of Ferdinand and Isabella, and with Granada fell all of Spain's greatness. For a brief while, indeed, the reflection of the Moorish splendor cast a borrowed light on the history of the land which was at once warmed with its sunny radiance. The great epoch of Isabella, Charles V, and Philip II, of Columbus, Cortez, and Pizarro shed a last halo about the dying monuments, the dying moments of a mighty state. Then followed the abomination of desolation, the rule of the stupid Inquisition, and the blackness of darkness in which Spain has been plunged ever since. In the land where science was once supreme, the Spanish doctors became noted for nothing but their ignorance and incapacity. And the discoveries of Newton and Harvey were condemned as pernicious to the faith. Where once 70 public libraries had fed the minds of scholars and 500,000 books had been gathered at Cordova for the benefit of the world, such indifference to learning afterwards prevailed that the new capital, Madrid, possessed not a single public library in the 18th century. Note that. The Moors left. They were kicked out at the end of the 15th century, having left 70 libraries. And when the Africans and Arabs were forced to return back into Africa by the 18th century, they didn't have one public library. The 16,000 looms of Seville soon dwindled to a fifth of their ancient number. The arts and industries of Toledo and Almeria faded into insignificance. The very baths, public buildings of equal ornament and use, were destroyed because cleanliness savored too strongly of rank infidelity. Note that. Do you know it was a sin to smile, to show any kind of sensuality, laughter during the Inquisition in some of the courts? The land deprived of the skillful irrigation of the Moors grew impoverished and neglected. The richest and most fertile valleys languished and were deserted. Most of the populous cities which had filled every district of Andalusia fell into ruinous decay, and beggars, friars, and bandits took the place of scholars, merchants, and knights. So low fell Spain when she had driven away the blacks. Such is the melancholy contrast offered by her history. And this is by Stanley Lane Poole, by the way. So that we have here a range of things. We find the corrective eyeglasses first begin among the Moors. We find a whole range of sciences and a great number of scientists, too many to mention. One of the things I have done is to reprint an essay, Cairo Science Academy of the Middle Ages, by Lumpkin and Zittler, which shows you what was pouring out of Cairo and pouring out of parts of Africa and out of Asia into Europe as a result of this. And people often ask the question, well, why is it that the Industrial Revolution did not occur in Africa? I was speaking at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology a week or so ago to graduate students there and explaining to them the tremendous advances in science that occurred in Africa, the steel smelting, the astronomical observatories, the tremendous advances in medicine, Africans using aspirin, tetracycline, antiseptics, etc. before us, developing vaccines. And the question arose, why, since Africa had all of these things, why there wasn't an industrial revolution? Let me attempt to answer that question. Africa was extremely unfortunate in this respect, that it was not unusual that it should build its civilization in Europe, because the Greeks built their civilization in Africa. The British built their civilization abroad. They didn't build it in Britain, although Britain was eventually to profit from this. But the remarkable thing that happened in Africa is that Africa was attacked and weakened during a decline. It was attacked, rather, and invaded during its decline, the decline of one of its centralized empires. Everyone knows that in the movement of civilization there are periods of weakness. America had such a period of weakness at the height of the Aztec Empire, when the Aztecs had become extremely powerful and arrogant, had many dissident tribes, Cortez, with his ragged army of Spaniards, were able to walk through the Aztecs because of the fact that as he marched forward, since he was not immediately attacked, that is the mistake that was made by Montezuma, king of the Aztecs. Montezuma could not have avoided that mistake because in the prophecy of the Aztecs, some sort of savior was supposed to arrive in 1519, a Quetzalcoatl was supposed to return. Stupid myth, but nevertheless, it had profound consequences. Because instead of attacking Cortez, when the Americans attacked Columbus's garrison, they wiped it out in one day. Columbus left the garrison after the first voyage. The Indians wiped it out in one day. The Aztecs could easily have destroyed all the Spaniards in 1 hour. But they allowed Cortez to advance unsure of his intentions, and by the time they were sure of his intentions, it was too late, because as Cortez advanced, he brought the dissident tribes along with him who wanted to get back at the Aztecs. Even as the Africans advanced into Europe under Hannibal, Europeans joined with the Africans against their own Europeans because they wanted to get back at the Romans. And this is exactly what happened here. It's unfortunate, but you have a breakup after the breakup of the Songhai Empire before Africa could catch its breath and build again as it had built after Ghana, as it had built after Mali, build again a centralized empire that could have had the integrity to resist outside invasion, at least for a time, and to build something in its place. Africa is broken up and fragmented, so that we have both internal and external reasons for this. The situation in Europe is that Europe profited not only from the Greek invasion of Egypt, it profited most from the Moorish invasion, because the African was unlike the Europeans. He did not seek to destroy what he found. He gave without destroying what he found. The European did not give us that mercy. He tried to destroy the root of everything he found. It was not enough to introduce his kind of thing. He wanted to wipe out everything we had in our head. That is the reason why, even though slavery is over, we are still his slaves. He has tried to colonize this universe. He has tried to establish dominion over our thoughts, over our consciousness so completely that we do not even accept our own history when it's presented to us again. It seems like such a bizarre, strange, astonishing thing. I remember in January when I was in England, I was coming out, there was a vast audience. I was quite astonished. You would think we were at, it was one of the Beatles shows. And I was very startled by this because the last time I had been to England, nobody wanted to listen to this stuff. Now they're listening because they're on the edge of a grave crisis. And I was coming outside and I met a strange man, and he said to me, "I am your family." This is exactly how he talked. "I am your family and I'm ashamed of you. I'm a distant relative of yours and I'm ashamed of you. You're fooling the black people. You know as well as I do that black people didn't do anything." He's about 60, 65, etc. Deep, deep sickness, which is very different from what I found when I was in Port of Spain. I was speaking to vast audiences stretched out into the streets. And when I was finished speaking, a black man came up to me, an old man, and started to pound his head on the table. I was very frightened because I thought his head would open up. And he said to me, he started to cry, and he said, "I am so grateful. I am so grateful. This is the first day that I'm proud to be a black man." This is in his 60s. So we begin to realize that this reconstruction is absolutely vital to us. African history cannot be reconstructed like European history. Europe does not need this kind of intense, precise sort of research. That is why in Cairo, when the Europeans arrived, even the people who brought the Cairo conference together, they said only 2 people arrived prepared. The Africans, Sheikh Anta Diop and Theophilo Benga. The Europeans brought nothing. They expected to walk through like before. They expected everybody to repeat their cliches and accept it. Sheikh Anthony up brought a truck full of books. And they couldn't get through anymore because we have put a stop to that. A line is being drawn. A whole body of scholars are emerging now, a whole school, because this is the new crusade. We don't need firearms because they're going to take the guns and turn it on themselves. What we need is the firepower of intellect. What we need is the ammunition of our history, the facts. We need the facts. We need to go back in our history and find once again the ground out of which we have come. We need to find these things so that we could set this whole place on fire. We could undermine the foundations of this civilization because this civilization is founded on a lie. The strength of blackness, the strength of the black man and woman lies in the morality of the truth. It is not necessary for us to exaggerate. It is not necessary for us to invent. It is not necessary for us to create new myths because the truth itself is more astonishing than any myth that we can create. The more we learn of that history, the more we become aware of the extraordinary richness that lies behind us. We belong to something that is quite extraordinary. We are no longer simply to be linked with slaves. We are no longer simply to be linked with the peripheral African. True, Kunte Kinte is one of my ancestors, so is Chicken George. But I am more than Chicken George. So roots is just a faint, it's just a faint strand in the wind, a faint thread. There are far more serious roots than that. Our roots do not lie in slavery. It lies in chapters and phases of history that go back to the very beginning of man. Because when we go into Europe, there is not a single Cro-Magnon, not a single Caucasoid until about 50,000 years ago. That is why when I was in Wales, many years ago, I was with African poets, Wole Soyinka, etc. And we were at this conference of Commonwealth Poets Festival. And every time these people get up, they talk about the younger members of the Commonwealth. And I got up and said, what do you mean by younger? In what sense are we younger than you? We are the elders of the world. How come we are the younger? If they were not so young, they would not have been so bloody insecure as to try to force down that civilization down our throat. If they were not so young, they would have had the generosity and the humanity to allow us to exist as people in our own right. Whatever the nature of their culture, whatever their conquest, whatever the nature of their domination, they could have allowed us to be human. But they wanted to cut everything out. They wanted to deny us our humanity, our history, our right to a separate consciousness, our right to a heritage, our right to a past. So that even today, everything we learn makes us realize that we're constantly having to move away veils in order to arrive at the truth of the past. It is covered with so many lies, it isn't funny. And as soon as you unveil one lie and you show them the truth, they find another excuse. Everything that we unveil, there is some explanation. Like when I found the stone head, well, I didn't find them, but when I made it obvious that those stone heads were African, we find an expert saying the reason why they have broad noses and thick lips is because the tools were blunt. Every frivolous excuse is used by the establishment in order to establish, in order to maintain, in order to consolidate the basic untruths that lie at the foundation of this civilization. We cannot stay silent. There's a different kind of revolution. A revolution that is more serious than rebellion. Rebellion is an act in which someone rebels against a leader or rebels against a system in such a way that even though they may triumph, they remain within the system because their consciousness is ruled by that system. Revolution is more serious. Revolution is not just the victory the rebellion and the possible victory over the enemy. Revolution involves thinking very differently from the enemy, so that when the defeat occurs, the defeat can even occur within the enemy. When the Jews, give them their due, when the Christian thing, through the Jews and others, when that Christian spirit began to undermine the Romans, all the value systems of the Romans were overturned. It wasn't just a question of a rebellion. Christ brought a revolution in consciousness. He made the little man important. When the Romans said to be great is to be rich, to be wealthy, to be powerful, Christ said, look at me, I'm not rich, I'm barefooted. I am not wealthy, I just have my shirt on my back. I am not powerful. I call myself King of the Jews, but my kingdom is somewhere else. This is where my kingdom is. This is my universe. Okay? That is what overturned. That is why when the Romans sat in that amphitheater, they thought they were all so arrogant they could laugh at the Christians, but when they saw the Christians walk straight into the mouth of the lion, something must have quivered in their heart. What strange people are these, that they could face the lions, and we who so rich and powerful would not dare. The laughter froze in their throats because they began to realize there was a new spirit alive in the world, a spirit so powerful that eventually it would undermine and overcome them. So that a strange conversion began in the very people who were seeking to destroy the Christ. So that something overturned them, so that his church was built right in Rome. This is what is going to happen here. You see it already beginning to happen in South Africa. Many of us despair because that is one of the darkest situations on this planet. Yet the strange thing is, would you have imagined last year South African businessmen going to talk with the rebel leader? Something is happening in here. Something frightening is beginning to happen in here. There reaches a stage in every civilization where its lies are so grave that they become glaring. They're no longer easy to cover up. This is part of it. Whenever you see so many facts begin to emerge suddenly, when for years they have not been emerging, when you see we could stand in outer space and send down our eyes through the African earth and find things that we didn't find before, when you see within the last 10 years all of these things we thought never existed in Africa, which had already been dismissed, suddenly coming out of the African earth, we are aware that there is a different eye opening. There's a different spirit coming alive in the world. We are part of that spiritual movement, part of that revolutionary process, part of that change in consciousness, part of that crusade. Thank you very much.
Now, as you can see in this lecture, Dr. Ivan van Sertima broke this thing down, and he brought out some very good in-depth factual information concerning the Moors. Now, what I find intriguing is not the fact that the Moors brought new technologies and advancements to the European countries, because when you study, and I mean when you really study true black history, you will find that the blacks are way more advanced than the non-melanated people in their advancements. But what I was really intrigued about was the fact that how hard and how far the non-melanated people would go in order to erase our history. What were they hiding? What were they afraid of? You know, like the Arab slave trade, the Moors are hardly ever talked about. Why is that? Well, I'll tell you why that is. Because for the world to acknowledge that the Moors once ruled parts of Europe and were kings and queens would be the ultimate front to our enemies. So they come up with all kinds of excuses to debunk our history and make very light of it. Now, you notice that I remember Dr. Van, he talked about that, and he mentioned every time that truth is unveiled about our people and something is discovered, here comes the heathens. They come right along and try to make up an excuse or try to debunk it. Oh, that's not true. That didn't happen. They try to put a white face with it. You know, and some of y'all look up the General Hannibal of Carthage, and you guys will be amazed. I think the History Channel did a series on that, and they actually had him as a black man. But if you watch some old movies, they got Hannibal of Carthage portrayed as a white person. Hannibal of Carthage was a black man, and his men slew over 70,000 Romans. That's when he gathered all the barbarians to rise up against the Romans. And it's something, but they're not going to tell you this in our history books. They're not going to share this stuff with you. And I'm telling you, it's getting to the point, Zion, where we have to really educate ourselves. Because if we sit around and we wait for this truth to come out, we wait for somebody else to tell us this truth, it's not going to come out. You know, when you look at more generals like Tariq, and there were much, much more. And, you know, I used to always wonder, how come I didn't hear about the Moors until recently? How come I didn't know about these people? And I'll be honest with you, I never really studied, I never knew who the Moors were coming up in high school. I never knew who they were because it was never talked about. It was not in the history books. And it's just one of the many, many hidden truths that the world has kept from us. And they know what they're doing, but I guarantee you the elites, they know who we are. They know what's going on. They know the history of our people. And so Zion, we got to take it upon ourselves to really dig for this information, because no one is going to give it to you. But know this, that everything that's done in the darkness, the Most High will bring to the light.